let me just say a few words about David's presentation and introduce our own. First of all, I was really struck by his comment about influence and the profound influence of the West on Chinese intellectuals. And it took me back to Robert Daly's presentation of this morning and how we think about influence and having some proportionality when we think about influence. Secondly, he brought up the late 80s and the early 90s and mentioned Tiananmen Square. And this is exam season in universities or just after. And whenever I think about Tiananmen Square, it was the day that I was writing my final exams as a master's student. And we were walking down the street and nobody had phones or internet. And the news began to spread of what was going on in Tiananmen Square. And it's very much linked to some of the themes we're going to address in this panel. But the third thing I can't resist saying is David's discussion of students and young people reminds me of how much we have in common with the Chinese. When he was mentioning how there's frustration that they're online and they don't read anymore, I was reminded of a conversation with some French senior academics who said, we have the crème de la crème at Sciences Po. They don't read. They don't know their history. And I think we all say that about young people. So it reminds me of what we have in common, although it excludes, of course, all the Max Bell students who are here, who are absolutely wonderful, right? So, and read everything I assign to them and everyone else assigns them. Thankfully, after two really difficult panels this morning, easy subject. How are we going to engage Canada and the United States on China's human rights record, right? Easy subject. Not easy at all, right? And we have a terrific panel who are coming together to help us maneuver through this. I just want to say in advance, she's actually not here, so I could say it quite freely. This is not going to be the Janice Stein definition of time. I'm going to be an equal opportunity moderator. Everyone's going to have the same amount of time, and I'm also going to draw on my UN experience where when you go past your time, the microphone gets turned off. But it won't be quite that bad, I promise. I'll just remind you of when you're close to your time. And we're going to start with Emile Dirks, who's a research associate with the Citizen Lab at the Munk School, an incredible Canadian treasure, who's also had various experiences in writing, but also at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. And he's going to talk a little bit about the link between China's domestic and international or transnational repression. And then we're going to move on to Dawn Murphy, an associate professor of national security strategy at the National War College, who has written extensively on China and the global South, and so particularly with respect to Africa and the Middle East. And so she's going to be talking a bit about how China seeks support for issues like Hong Kong and Xinjiang in Africa and the Middle East. Then we'll move on to Jennie Chen, who's the executive director of the Greater China Policy and Coordination Division at GAC, who's also had postings in New York, in DC, Beijing, and Kandahar. Most important thing on her resume, she has an MA from McGill. And she will be talking about the current challenge of the human rights agenda and China in the multilateral system, which is something I hope we can talk more about. And then finally, last but not least, James Millward, who introduced himself last night as the Xinjiang guy, who's the professor of intersocietal history at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, who's written extensively on Xinjiang. And he wants to conclude the panel presentations for us by talking about state-level areas where Canada and the US can cooperate on human rights issues, but also bring us back to this important people-to-people ties question. So I'm going to first turn it over to Emile.
Very quickly, so it's 5 to 8 minutes we've got?
Yeah.
Okay, and I should also clarify, I think you mentioned a Canadian treasure. That was referring to Citizen Lab, not to me.
Yes,
So
both.
Purpose of humility.
Yes.
That's
yes,
lab,
the Citizen Lab, but also you, yeah.
No, but thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to be talking about an ongoing project that myself and Professor Diana Fu at the University of Toronto have been working on. She unfortunately couldn't be here today. And it's an evolving research agenda about Chinese state transnational repression and foreign interference. So we all know that domestic repression is a persistent feature of politics in China. We also know that it's increased under Xi Jinping alongside broader efforts to exert greater party-state control over Chinese society. However, what we're seeing is that increasing domestic repression within China has also had the consequence of leading to kind of international repercussions in the form of transnational repression outside of the borders of the PRC. Those that China targets at home, like activists, dissidents, members of ethnic and religious minority communities, tend to be the people that it's pursuing abroad. The Chinese government and its proxies have forcibly returned Uyghurs from Egypt and Thailand to China, kidnapped publishers of banned books, threatened the family members of overseas activists, harassed and assaulted critics on and offline, and also expanded its anti-corruption campaign into communities around the world. Many of those targeted by Beijing are Chinese citizens. However, we should also remember that they're also people who are not Chinese citizens. They're people who are connected to China not by citizenship, but by heritage or ancestry. Again, Chinese, Hong Kongers, Tibetans, and Uyghurs, among others. What connects them is not only that China views them as threats, but also that China views them as subjects. And through transnational oppression, the Chinese state attempts to use coercion to exercise sovereignty over them. So the challenge of Chinese state transnational oppression is something that I think Ottawa and Washington have been slow to recognize. Diaspora members have long spoken out about state-backed threats and intimidation they have faced within their communities, but it's really only in the last few years that this issue seems to have moved into the public consciousness. Much as Canada and the US have had to contend with China's domestic human rights record, Canada and the US are now having to contend with China's capacity to coerce and harass diaspora members overseas. We have seen the US authorities recently open criminal cases against a number of people suspected of involvement in transnational repression, most notably individuals connected to a so-called overseas police service station in New York, and a Boston College student who threatened and harassed a fellow Chinese international student who was engaged in pro-democracy activism within the United States. While the US and Canada are belatedly tackling the problem of Chinese state transnational repression, I think, though, it's not always clear that policymakers or even the public at large in the US and Canada and other countries actually have a common or shared understanding of what constitutes transnational oppression. So there's a lot of people here in the policy world. I really don't want to be offering policy advice, but I do think having a shared understanding of what we mean when we talk about transnational oppression could be a small and important step, given that responding to this particular issue requires international cooperation. So for Diane and I, we see transnational repression specifically as a form of coercive foreign interference, whereby repressive states target diaspora members specifically, who the state views both as subjects and opponents. Other forms of foreign interference, which the previous panel covered, would impact Canadians and Americans regardless of heritage. Foreign interference could include covert disinformation campaigns, electoral interference. But I think what we want to highlight is that transnational oppression is uniquely focused on diaspora members connected to that repressive state. It's an extension of that state's domestic repression outwards into the homes and communities of diaspora members who should feel safe from the reach of Beijing. Even though the primary victims are diaspora members, however, transnational repression impacts our core democratic institutions. People can't participate freely in democratic life if they fear the reach of an authoritarian state. And again, addressing this issue basically is requiring us to contend both with China's domestic human rights record as well as its rights record abroad. Finally, I think it's necessary to state that the problem of transnational oppression is not unique to China. Russia, Iran, Turkey, India, Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, many countries, many states target their diaspora opponents abroad. If this is an era of democratic backsliding, I think it's also an era of rising transnational repression. So developing solutions to this problem requires developing solutions that don't focus specifically on Beijing or any one country. Also, I think it will require Canada, the US, and others to seek cooperation not just among global North countries, but also within countries in the global South. Many of the most egregious cases of Chinese state transnational oppression, including individual or mass forced deportations of Uyghurs or others, have occurred in countries like Thailand, Myanmar, and Egypt, with the explicit or tacit approval of local authorities. So China has leveraged its relations with these countries to pursue diaspora opponents living in or transiting through these global South states. Now, I think we can all agree it's probably hard to get an authoritarian or illiberal regime to care about their own rights record. Certainly hard to get them to concern themselves with China's rights record on transnational repression. However, the Global South also includes vibrant democracies which enjoy friendly relations both with the US and Canada and with China. And I think successfully dealing with the transnational repression problem as a global problem, whether by Beijing or other states, will require buy-in from those Global South countries. However, again, gaining their buy-in means not framing this issue in China-specific terms. These countries will not be willing to partner with us or others on these human rights issues if doing so requires them to take a firm stance against China. Framing human rights concerns, including addressing the issue of transnational oppression, has a much better chance of succeeding at an international level if it's an approach that focuses on a problem more broadly, as opposed to one that's focusing on Beijing or Moscow or Tehran alone. And finally, just as a closing comment, I think dealing with transnational oppression will also mean demonstrating that the same human rights standards that we are demanding China live up to, we also adhere to, and that we make the same demands of our allies. I think being hypocritical in the matter of human rights is not only wrong on principled reasons, I think it will actually make it much more difficult to deal with these issues at an international level, especially when seeking cooperation from countries in the Global South.
Thank you very much, and stuck beautifully to time. Wow, no need to rip the microphone from you at all. Fantastic, and I hope we come back to this question of how we think about this cooperatively in a multilateral setting. But I'm also, struck by your point about hypocrisy. And there's many things about our current era which makes this challenging, but if we think about a human rights agenda in 2024, it's a much more fraught exercise for a variety of reasons that we can talk about. And I know this is of interest to Jennie too. Dawn, can I hand it over to you? Thank you.
Absolutely. So I need to start with a quick disclaimer that the views that I express today are my own, and they don't represent the U.S. National War College, the National Defense University, or the U.S. government more broadly. And my comments today are very much based in my own research. As was said in the introduction, I look at China's relations with the Middle East and Africa, as well as China's interactions with the international order in those regions. So really my comments deal with China's approach to human rights in these regions broadly, but I think this has really significant insights into China's approach to human rights in the Global South more broadly. So the first thing I want to highlight is that, as all of you know, there are tensions between state sovereignty and human rights. And I think this really plays out in China's own domestic conceptualization of the prioritization of human rights within its own borders, but also in the ways in which it interacts in the human rights space in the Middle East and Africa. So many states in the regions that I study have colonial legacies that make them quite concerned about adhering to state sovereignty, often at the expense of individual rights. And as many of you know, China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is a very strict interpretation of Westphalian sovereignty, is something that they promote greatly, and they have for many, many decades in the Global South, in the Middle East, and Africa in particular. The next thing I want to say in general is that China, both domestically and in the regions that I study, prioritizes economic rights over political and civil rights. So you see most of the space that I think you can categorize as advocacy for international or global human rights being very much centered on economic development, on foreign aid, on some human security issues. And you see this play out in their cooperation forums and in a number of other forums. But I just want to point out that I do think that there is this prioritization in what they emphasize in these regions. And in recent years, you see this, I think, very at least more clearly articulated in recent initiatives that they've announced: the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, as well as the Global Civilization Initiative. And I don't have enough time today because I'm going to keep my remarks brief, but I would point you to those. And when you look at the actual substance of those initiatives, there's a very heavy emphasis on economic rights as opposed to individual political and civil rights. Next, I want to provide 3 examples of HR issues, of human rights issues, that really kind of manifest themselves in my own research. So one issue is regarding Xinjiang and the Middle East and Africa. And so this has been, over the years, having a desire for states in the regions that I study to remain relatively silent regarding what is occurring in Xinjiang, wanting to ensure that these states don't provide material support to Uyghurs in Xinjiang, right? This has been a longstanding concern. But I would say in recent years, even encouraging states to make more proactive statements supporting what China is doing in Xinjiang. And so this plays out in a number of ways. So one would be through cooperation forums. In 2022, the very last meeting that occurred for the China Arab States Cooperation Forum, for the first time there was verbiage included in the declaration of that forum, essentially indicating that there was a respect between Arab states and China for the way in which they treated ethnic minorities within their own borders, which very much is key, code words for behavior in Xinjiang. You've also seen, statements come out, whether it be from the Palestinian Authority, President Abbas, when he was visiting Beijing in early 2023, providing supportive statements, and other forms. I don't have time to go into all the manifestations of this, but a few years ago you had these dueling letters in the UN, where you had a letter come out that criticized China for its behavior in Xinjiang. A few days later, you had another letter that did not advocate for China's behavior in Xinjiang, but emphasized all the positive ways in which China is advocating for human rights, particularly in the economic space. And as Jim may bring this up, but you also see many states in the many states in the regions that I look at, in the UN Human Rights Council, helping to suppress discussion of Xinjiang as an issue in various ways. You have similar activity in relation to Hong Kong, and I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail about that, but over the years, increasingly, you have statements coming out in cooperation forums, in strategic partnerships, in other formal statements from states in the Middle East and Africa, essentially advocating for China's approach to Hong Kong, which is a human rights issue. The third example I want to bring up is China's approach to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So over time, decades, China has emphasized a concern regarding the treatment of Palestinians and what they view as Israel's disproportionate response to each and every flare-up in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict broadly. There's a very long history of them making statements. They frame their critique very much in the realm of human rights law, in international law, of concerns regarding that. Since October 7th, you've seen this amplified in various ways, including in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, China coming out with statements that essentially frame Hamas's behavior as a struggle for national liberation. And this, again, from a human rights standpoint, gets into an advocacy for self-determination, which clearly is in deep tension with sovereignty, but also is in deep tension with some of China's own domestic behavior, right? So I think we have to acknowledge there are these contradictions between what China says it stands for on the international stage and its own behavior. And the other thing I would pull in about this is just the degree to which countries in the Middle East and Africa, if their interpretation of what's happening on the ground in the Israel-Hamas war right now, or the Palestinian-Israel conflict more broadly, to the degree that those views align, the ways in which China stands up for the Palestinians through a lens of human rights and through a lens of preventing harm to civilians, I think it makes it much harder for the US, Canada, other countries to get traction on criticisms regarding Xinjiang. Next, I want to make just a few recommendations because we've been asked to bring in this US-Canada divergence and convergence aspect. And I'm not an expert on Canadian foreign policy, so I will just bring up some issues that I think we all should think about. So one is, I think we need to recognize that China's approach to human rights, this prioritization of the economic over the political and of emphasizing, certain issues, I think we need to acknowledge that resonates with many countries in the Middle East and Africa, as well as much of the global South, including democracies. partially because of a legacy of colonization, but also because China's views on these issues have been long held, and China's been interacting with these states for a long time. And it's only recently that China's interactions with the Middle East and Africa, I think, have become so high profile. But I think their stance has some legitimacy in the eyes of many states in these regions because they have been consistent on emphasizing those issues. The next issue I would say is we need to consider each aspect of human rights, both in isolation and together, in order to identify areas for cooperation. And the reason I say this is there may be issues of human rights associated with poverty alleviation or economic development or foreign aid or a number of other issues that the US, Canada, and China could cooperate on. But we need to think through those issues in isolation, and then we do need to think through the way in which those are intertwined. And my final comment on this would be, I think we need to be very careful, at least from a US perspective, the ways in which we use human rights in an instrumental way. Because, at least in my own interviewing, many states, many elites in the Middle East and Africa see the criticism of what's occurring in Xinjiang as part of this broader strategic competition between the US and China. And I think that's deeply damaging to US interests for it to be perceived in that way. But I think that's part of why we need to look at areas potentially for cooperation where interests do align on some of these values, as well as criticizing China on human rights. Because the umbrella that encompasses human rights does include a lot of different issue areas that I do think there are potentially some shared interests between all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Dawn. Just first of all, it's lovely to hear ideas about Canadian foreign policy from people who are not Canadians. It's always welcome, so never be shy about doing that. We need all the help we can get, all the advice we can get. But just very interesting in your discussion of China and human rights to remind us, and this I think is something that Jennie wants to turn to next, is that if we're thinking about multilateral fora as one place, not the only place, because I know James is going to talk about other things in which the US and Canada might think about working collaboratively, we need to recognize how invested China is in working with existing human rights mechanisms. So I was at a conference recently where an academic delivered a very cogent analysis of China's last appearance before the Universal Periodic Review process in Geneva on human rights, and how it had lined up state after state after state, because they're not given much time to speak, going back to my theme of before, to say positive things about China's human rights record. So they stacked the room, a metaphor that's being used a lot in Canada these days in another context. They stacked the room and had people speaking one after the other, representing states from around the world, giving a positive assessment. So they're heavily engaged in these existing mechanisms talking about human rights. And that's really important for us, I think, to remember. Jennie, that's, I hope, was a good segue for you and your comments.
Thank you, Jennifer. Bonjour tout le monde. It's a great pleasure to be here. 下午好. Thank you for that. And I'm grateful for your opening comments, especially as we're approaching the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre incident, whatever word, verbiage you want to attach. 35. Sorry, I stand corrected. But a very important anniversary coming up in just a few weeks. So it's a very apt theme for us today. Before I just get into human rights, I thought I'd take a few seconds just to remind everybody where we are on Canadian policy with China. I think that seems to be, seems to be a high level of curiosity about where we are now. I guess I'll just touch briefly on it. Obviously, the Michaels period was really transformative for the policy environment in Ottawa. It almost seemed like a shock to the system that Canada, somehow the nice people of Canada, was a target of Chinese coercive diplomacy. So I would say we've come out of it. We've done a lot of work over the last few years with, I think, clarity of mind. Not that we didn't have it before, but sort of a reassessment of the China that we're dealing with today. We have this clarity of mind, I would say a very focused approach, really based and founded on Canadian interests. And I cannot underscore this enough, Canadian interest, frankly, not US interest or US or Australian interest or European interest or Japanese interest. This is very much a Canadian interest approach. So first and foremost. So these days we've been focused on cleaning up our backyard. I think some of that came up this morning, whether it's been new policies on research security, foreign interference, our 5G, and of course the release of our Indo-Pacific strategy. That all came out of really this reassessment of the country that we're dealing with right now. I would say the second theme is we're doing the diplomacy and doing it with as professionally as we can. We're doing it with patience. We're taking into consideration the responsibility that we have to deal with a country like China, not in a media kind of irresponsible way. If you're going to deal with China and deal with them tough, we better be good at what we're doing. So we have to be very serious and be very clear, and we're patient. We have to have a willing dance partner if we're going to do anything. It's not just about Canada. China has equity in this relationship as well. And we're not about building a great relationship or pretending that we're going to be friends again. That's not what it is. It's really about managing the relationship and ensuring that Canadian interests continue to be protected and projected. So, sorry, I just wanted to sort of preface some of my remarks with that. So the session is not about Canadian policy, so I'll just move quickly to human rights. I would say throughout this last few years of volatility on Canada-China relations, human rights has actually, our approach has been unwavering. We've always been, for those who've been in my chair previously, there's a few of you here today, we've always been very strong on human rights. You can ask our American friends and the government and the Europeans and other like-mindeds. This has been, I would say, a record that we can be very proud of. And human rights remains a very important core function of my team in Ottawa. As for the situation in China, I won't go into it too much. There's people who are more expert in this field than I am, and especially amongst this very informed audience. But we are highly concerned, and it's becoming much more difficult to do this work, whether it's because of the new anti-espionage law in China or the new national security legislation in Hong Kong. The signs aren't encouraging, and it's very difficult more than ever to really engage with civil society in country or with alternative voices. But I would say the new trend that we're seeing over the years, and Emile, thank you for raising this, but of course, is it's not just about the issues in China, it's outside of China. And not just outside of China, but it's in a whole other sort of dimension. We're talking about cyberspace, we're talking about social media, we're talking about China's reach, their confidence, they're able to extend outside of China very effectively. And so I think this is a challenge for all of us, is how do we address these massive challenges that are just so, I would say they're just, they're everywhere, I guess. And for us, it becomes a question of bandwidth, about capability, about priority, and can we save everybody? And we cannot, right? And I would say, I'm glad you mentioned some of these other countries, is while we work with China on human rights bilaterally and multilaterally, I would also add another element is this new triangulation of our China diplomacy with third countries. So now when we're doing Canada-Thailand relations, yes, we're talking about China. When we're doing Canada-Turkey, it's all about China. When we're doing Canada, so there's a whole new level of diplomacy that's required, especially when we're talking about the fate of Uyghurs or Tibetans and other groups that have worked hard to get out of China. And of course, I think there in the previous session, you would have talked more about transnational repression, foreign interference, cyber, so I won't get into that too much more, but other than you will have noticed in G7 statements and others, you may have seen this reference to Vienna Conventions in a number of our statements. These references to Vienna Conventions, I invite you to really take a look at, is because this is our signal to China, is that they are violating what we feel are very important foundational pillars of the Vienna Conventions. Just quickly on Hong Kong, we're watching closely. I would say it's a really tricky environment. We're in an unprecedented period of change. We have a tremendous level of respect for the people of Hong Kong. They're very well educated. They know what they're doing. They have agency in this place. At the same time, I always tell people nostalgia is not helpful for the Hong Kong that it used to be. And it's really challenging to speculate about what the future of Hong Kong will look like, other than we've been wrong about China so many times before. So while we have to be really critical and maintain that critical view of Hong Kong, we also have to be open-minded about what the future of Hong Kong could be under the new frameworks that it's going to find itself in. So we are just ready for anything. Maybe Taiwan. With the release of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the invasion of Ukraine, and I would say the very crude wake-up call that COVID gave all of us about the vulnerability of our supply chains, we've been taking a hard look about stability across the cross straits. It does mean a lot for Canada. I cannot underscore this enough, whether it's geostrategically, economically, and for the theme of this panel, symbolically. It is a very wonderful, messy, vibrant democracy in Taiwan that shares many of our values. So I would just say, our One China policy, of course, remains as unwavering, but it does not preclude robust economic engagement, people-to-people engagement with Taiwan, and Taiwan's voice is important. And we're seeing this play out across around the world, even here in Montreal. I'm thinking of ICAO here as well. So we see it and hear it everywhere. Sorry, I know I just have a few seconds left, but I will touch on multilateral just a bit. And I'm glad Dawn raised this a little bit, is China's invested heavily in the multilateral system. And frankly, Canada, we have a lot to catch up with. They really get that the multilateral system is the way to go. If they, we talk about the erosion of the rules-based international order. Well, actually, they know the rules better than we do, and they're running circles around us. So we all have to up our game when it comes to the multilateral system, because they're very good at it. They're very good negotiators. They can be very crude and blunt, at the same time, very elegant and very rational. And they also make mistakes too. So, but they are going forward full bore. So, and they were taking advantage of all of these opportunities. So we have our work cut out for them. And the other element of this is that their narratives do have traction in many countries. And you think, Canada has this great image, we have these great values, but you know what? It's been a really interesting reality check for all of us, is that, that's not really what other countries and other governments are interested in hearing about. So China does offer something that is attractive to other countries. And they do have a lot to offer. They do, like for infrastructure, they are doing some good things. We cannot poo-poo everything that they do. They do some very, very good things. So we have to really maintain a high level of objectivity about their role. And they do occupy a place in this multilateral system that is commensurate with their size and importance. Maybe just quickly on U.S., just to say bottom line, we're doing a lot with the U.S. We're joined at the hip in many ways. We're very good friends across the board, so we're very grateful for ongoing partnership with the United States. So I will stop there. Thank you.
I may ask you to elaborate that before we go to the floor. Just really interesting to have your take on another form of Chinese influence, which is influence in the multilateral system. And I guess very similar to what Emile said about transnational repression not being solely a Chinese activity, the idea of using the multilateral system to promote a particular understanding of rights or to hide a human rights crisis inside your country is not solely a Chinese activity. And when we look back historically, I think that's the case. So the question to ask is, how new is this? How powerful is this? But it's certainly, with human rights being such a key part of a state's domestic jurisdiction, this is always such a sensitive area that states attempt to own the narrative internationally. And we can think of tons of examples of that. So James, I will turn finally to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will say that in the course of shortening, my remarks have taken a slightly different turn than those that you just introduced me.
All right, we stand to be surprised.
So yes.
I like it.
So I'm here today as a historian of China and Inner Asia. Inner Asia is Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia. And of course, the issues in Xinjiang have parallels in those other places, and with Uyghurs and Mongols and Tibetans, and even in Hong Kong as well. In PRC parlance, those issues are often called minority problems, right? Or separatist problems. But we don't talk about indigenous peoples in the US and Canada as minorities, at least not anymore. And I think we should think about Xinjiang and Tibet, both of which were added to the PRC after October of 1949, when Mao Zedong stood up in Tiananmen Square and declared that the Chinese people had stood up. We should think about these territories and the issues that the CCP state has with peoples from Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia. We should think about them as problems arising from past and ongoing colonialism. What links them all together and also brings in Hong Kong and Taiwan is that they all derive from how the PRC has understood and treated the legacy of the Qing Empire. And we should think about that legacy of Qing Empire as similar to that of the legacy of Austria-Hungary, or of the Russian empires, of the Ottoman empires, and not as a sui generis Chinese Orientalist empire that we often imagine. It's much more similar to those other old empires than we think. The issues are ultimately those of how people with cultures and languages different from those of a dominant group and a history living on their own land that is now under the control of that outside dominant group, how these people can live as themselves in nations named for and controlled by others, and in a world that is organized around nation states. So human rights are meant to be universal. Therefore, one of the most important places where we talk about them, where we define them, where we try to enforce them and write international law about them are these multilateral institutions, these international institutions that we've been talking about, including various bodies under the UN, such as the UN Human Rights Council, or the International Court of Justice, or created by the UN, such as the ICC under the Rome Statute. These institutions are particularly important when it comes to the rights of peoples as groups, as ethnic groups, the rights to maintain their languages and culture, rights not to be displaced from their lands, rights not to be killed for their ethnic identity. Genocide, of course, is legally defined by a United Nations convention. We have all sorts of other definitions floating around in popular understandings and so on, but the legal definition is from the United Nations. These are the rules, or among the rules, of the rules-based international order, which the Biden administration holds up as its main argument regarding PRC behavior on the international stage. We're constantly talking about this rules-based international order. Despite being an organization comprised of nations, the UN has over time begun to find ways to support subnational groups such as indigenous peoples and unrepresented peoples. Now, as has already been mentioned on this panel, China now exercises increasing power in the United Nations, not just through its ability to make votes in the General Assembly go its way, but by rewriting and redefining key language, particularly that surrounding human rights itself. China has also been wielding that power to prevent Uyghurs and Tibetans from taking advantage of UN redress as indigenous peoples. China's rising clout in international institutions is one reason why, if the United States and Canada are serious about human rights for non-Han groups in China, this is one reason why the US and Canada must think carefully and rethink their approach to another settler colonial situation, that of Israel and Palestine, and how that approach to Israel and Palestine is hobbling the US ability to hold the PRC to account for its own human rights violations. Blatant hypocrisy, especially given ongoing US and Canadian military support for Israeli mass killing of civilians in Gaza, this is one reason why this rethinking is necessary. But more directly, the US cannot use the tools that it helped create. It cannot or will not apply those rules of the rules-based international order when it comes to the rights of Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Mongols. Rather, the US tends to cede the field to the PRC. I'll give you just one example of this. Just as we were learning back in 2018 about the extent of the atrocities going on in Xinjiang, the Trump administration withdrew the U.S. from the UN Human Rights Council because that body kept criticizing Israeli treatment of Palestinians. So this was a great relief to the PRC and helped enable its manipulation of that body or control over that body, the dueling votes that we mentioned before. When not taking its ball and going home, the United States has diminished an attempt to undermine the only institutions where genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity can be adjudicated. Again, this is not entirely, but is often due to the threat that these institutions might reach findings against Israel. The Uyghurs were happy when the Canadian Parliament and the US administration, the Trump administration on its last day, declared that what was happening to them was a genocide. But now many Uyghurs look with bewilderment when South Africa brings a formal case that genocide is being committed in Gaza. They see the voluminous presentation of evidence, the use of testimony, the proper judicial procedures, all of which are going to leave a solid historical record. Uyghurs reasonably wonder why wasn't their case properly brought the same way before the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. Now, there are various reasons for this having to do with the nature of those bodies, but ultimately it comes down to the fact that the US does not want to be part of any international legal institutions, and in fact tends to talk about them with scorn, as with the ICJ genocide case brought by South Africa, or US or US politicians even issue threats to sanction the jurists and their families, as with the ICC. Now, of course, it's not just unconditional support for Israel that undermines US and Canadian efforts to hold the PRC to account for human rights abuses. Both the US and Canada, like China, are countries built on a settler colonial past. Canada does a somewhat better job of recognizing this publicly than does the United States. China does not admit this settler colonial past at all, and yet China has very consciously studied what it sees as successful North American examples of integrating native peoples and incorporating their land. The PRC doesn't understand this history properly or take away the right lessons. For example, a current slogan being used in China echoes the idea of a melting pot to define the goals of ethnicity policy, to forge strongly a Chinese collectivity consciousness. And the PRC is even forcing non-Han Uyghurs and Tibetans into its own version of residential boarding schools, which form such a horrific episode from the North American past. So speaking of convergence then, between the US, Canada, and actually China as well, this common colonial legacy is a point of convergence for US, Canada, and the PRC. In addition to calling out and attempting to sanction in targeted ways PRC human rights abuses, the US and Canada should bring to our own foreign policy an understanding of and humility about our own past treatment of Native peoples. We should be aware of our own ongoing struggles with pluralism in our own societies, with diversity in our own societies, and we should communicate when the opportunities arise with Chinese interlocutors that the solution is not homogenizing, that diversity is not a bug but a feature of a modern state. The solution is not trying to melt everyone down into one blob, but rather in trying to find ways to incorporate diversity workably and equitably within a national system. High-level autonomy for ethnocultural groups, such as Quebec itself, for all of its tensions, this is a better example to offer to China than residential schools or unquestioning support for ongoing settler colonialism and violence elsewhere.
Okay. Great, thank you, James. And you did go in a slightly different direction, but thanks so much. And just two comments. If you are interested in asking a question, make your way to the microphone. I am going to ask the panelists one question, though, myself first, so you can get your thoughts together. Just as a comment, James, what I think is very interesting about your presentation is it leads us to the realization that, just as David was speaking at lunchtime about how things have changed since the early 1990s in China, the world has changed a lot with respect to the promotion of human rights since the early 1990s. That was the golden age, right, of the victory over communism, transnational human rights advocacy, and yes, that's still going on, but the war for the narrative about human rights is much more contested now. And so the question I just wanted to ask all the panelists, if you're willing to come in, is that, given the discussion we've had a little bit here so far about the multilateral framework, the formal one, and how difficult it is because of both the claim of the Global South that there's some hypocrisy, but also China's own deafness in courting certain countries, is that the wrong place for Canada and the US to be thinking about cooperating on this tough question of human rights? I mean, I ask this question somewhat reluctantly, given my own interests and commitments. Is it more thinking about organizations like the G7, coordinated targeted sanctions? How do you think these two countries can go about it in the spirit of humility that James has discussed? But what would be some ways of doing it? And do you agree with my somewhat overstatement of, is the multilateral framework the right one? I've put you on the spot, so if you feel you can't address it, you can pass. But I would be interested just in, as we go down the line, any thoughts before we take questions? Please come to the microphone if you have them. Jennie.
Not an easy.
No. I told you how easy this panel was going to be, right?
I guess I'm thoughtful. I think I'm hopeful. I was conveying some frustration about our multilateral system and the various mechanisms. I'm thoughtful of we're approaching, I'm hoping I'm getting this anniversary right, the second anniversary of the release of the Xinjiang report. No, I'm glad you did. The Xinjiang report that came out of the High Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we are awaiting some follow-up, frankly, from that office on the outcomes of that report. And I know we've been doing all the diplomacy we need to do with that office and with others to see what can be done. We've seen special rapporteurs through Geneva, left, right, and center, saying all these things, and to what effect. You can't hide these problems anymore. People know about it, but yet there's been no qualitative change, I would say. So there's still, how do we unpack all of this going forward and thinking about the so-called Global South countries? I guess some of the work that we've been undertaking is better understanding China's value proposition in some of these countries. So we're not the experts, for example, in Canada on Africa, but we know our colleagues in the UK and France that know Africa better than anyone, and frankly, all the baggage they bring with them, but also they know Africa better than we do. So they are doing that work with why is China suddenly a compelling sort of actor for our African friends. So we are also doing that work here in the Americas, our backyard, and doing that sort of analytical work to better understand why the Chinese proposition is attractive. Is it just economics? Is it just, is there something else there that we're not seeing and feeling? And then, so I think we're still in that information gathering stage. Again, approaching this with humility, understanding everybody. A lot of us have colonial pasts that have to be well understood, and many of these countries won't forget those. So I think that is, maybe I'll stop there and let others reflect.
Yes, and just to build on what you've said, this very strong emphasis in Chinese diplomacy on the right to development being the primary human right, from which others then come, and Dawn mentioned this. Emile, do you want to make any comments on this question of mine, or do you want to pass?
I feel like actually Dawn would be the best person to speak next, given her expertise, and then if I have anything to contribute at the end, I can throw
Dawn,
in
go ahead.
remarks.
So briefly, so I think we need to look at it from multiple layers, right? So the multilateral, I don't think the US, Canada, or any other state that cares about human rights should give up on the multilateral, right? Even the debates that are occurring in the UN Security Council regarding the Israel-Hamas war, I mean, a lot of these are human rights issues, and there are shared interests, arguably, between permanent members of the Security Council, right? Or on development goals, or on other issues. So I don't think we should abandon those, but I do think that there are other configurations. So just as an example, the US, Canada, and maybe the European Union and the African Union coming together and looking at issues of human rights and identifying some ways to cooperate on specific issue areas. Or trilateral, the US, China, and South Africa coming together. So I think it needs to happen at every level across various functional areas. But giving up, from my perspective, the multilateral organizations, as far as promoting universal human rights, even if there's a different prioritization among other states, I don't think we should give up on that. Because I do think once that is lost, a lot of the international law behind it also dissolves in a way where it's going to be much harder for any state to advocate for human rights.
Yeah, thank you. James, do you want to go next? No? Emile, any thoughts?
No, I think the two of them said it perfectly.
Okay, Joanne, my colleague, please.
All right, thank you for a great panel. I especially appreciate Professor Millward's reflection at the end. I have a quick question for Emile and a quick question for Professor Murphy. For your study with Diana Fu on this transnational repression, right? I'm curious how pervasive is this operation that China is doing? Are you looking at hundreds, thousands of cases? What is the picture here? Another question for Professor Murphy is, what's your observation when these two principles of China's foreign policy, one is, when there's a tension between these two principles, one is the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that you mentioned, the other one is the economic primacy, right? Economic interests. China prioritize economic interests over other, political or human rights issues. When there's a tension between these two, meaning that in the case of, for example, Sudan and South Sudan, what's your observation in terms of how China navigate between its 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and its economic interest in the region? Thank you.
So thank you for your question. In terms of the scale of the problem, there's a few different organizations or researchers who've tried to put together data sets that are counting the number of known cases or suspected cases of transnational oppression. Freedom House has done a lot of work on that. Their data set also includes cases from other countries as well, say Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others. I think one issue is kind of methodological, which is generally speaking, the cases that are being added into those data sets are ones that we know publicly based on media reports or things that work their way into advocacy reports or whatnot. There you're seeing hundreds of cases, hundreds of known cases. But of course, there are ones that go beyond that. The other thing with Freedom House's data set, this is not a problem, it's just a decision they made. They're focusing specifically on cases that occur offline, right? So cases of assault or harassment or surveillance. They're not necessarily looking at digital transnational oppression, the threats or harassment or intimidation of activists or others on online spaces, be it WeChat, Twitter, Facebook, or others. Colleagues of mine at the Citizen Lab have been doing a bit of work on this, not specifically on China, but on a range of actors. Those become a bit harder to count, but it's certainly a large problem. But I do want to just maybe highlight something or just go back to a point that I made in my remarks, and this kind of dovetails with something that Robert mentioned in his remarks, which is really being focused in terms of what we mean by transnational oppression. I think there's a tendency to talk about Chinese influence and conflate that with foreign interference, and then to look at foreign interference and just lump everything we don't like about China into that particular category, right? So when we are thinking of transnational oppression, I think it pays to be very discreet, to say these are cases of state coercion by the Chinese state or its proxies against individuals who by heritage or citizenship are connected to China. It's against people who are Chinese, Uyghur, Hong Kong, Tibet, and Mongol, and others. We really need to be very clear that that's the specific problem we're talking about when we look at transnational oppression. We're not necessarily, it could dovetail or align itself with other things like misinformation or electoral interference, but it's separate. I also think it really pays to be very concrete about this, because what I see in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere is a tendency, again, to lump all of China's overseas activities into this basket of just things we don't like, right? And so if you're looking at, say, Confucius Institutes, I think this was a point that was made in the previous panel, this is really soft power, maybe poorly done soft power, but really not a case of foreign interference. And when we're looking at something like disinformation or misinformation online, yes, we can look at this malign activity, covert activity as being a case of foreign interference, but transnational oppression is very specific, and it's going to require very specific policy responses, even going beyond something like a foreign agent registry here in Canada. But certainly, I think also, and I just made the last point, one of the reasons as well why there's been perhaps an undercounting of incidents of transnational oppression is because many of the communities that are impacted have either provided this information to the authorities and have been ignored, or there are people coming from communities who actually don't trust the authorities or don't trust the police, right? And I think it's really up to those authorities, those state institutions, to demonstrate that they're worthy of that trust, rather than just saying, look, you need to come to us. It's up to you to kind of bravely, make your case known to us, the public, or to the state.
And on the question that you asked on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence versus economic interests or economic development, I'll just give 2 examples. You brought up Sudan, South Sudan. So I would say in general, in Africa, Middle East, 5 principles of peaceful coexistence take priority over economic interests in general. But on Sudan, South Sudan, that's an example where what China did was it used its special envoy for Africa issues to attempt to mediate, early 2010s between these states and going on. So I think they still attempt to impact the situation, but ultimately sovereignty is more important. Another example, though, that I think illuminates some of these tensions, the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea recently, right? So that is a case where I would say sovereignty is taking priority over economic interests as far as the sovereignty of Iran, not wanting to interfere domestically within Yemen. But this is also a case where China's support for the Palestinians and seeing the Houthi attacks on ships in the Red Sea as a broader spillover from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that they're not wanting to pick sides. So I would say the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence go together with the desire not to take sides and to be seen as a balanced actor that results in a case where you can make arguments regarding how much China's economic interests truly are being impacted at this point. But this is a case where, as opposed to the Gulf of Aden with piracy, where they participated in anti-piracy and maritime security efforts, they are not interacting in that same way in this case.
I'm going to go back to the floor in a second, but I want to return us a little bit to this question of Canada-US cooperation with respect to human rights violations in China. And perhaps Jennie and James and others, if you'd like to come in, if we can talk for a moment about other tools that might be used, cooperation on sanctions. You made the very interesting comment, Jennie, recognizing we can't save everyone, but there's also an aspect of this immigration and asylum policy, right? Is this a lever that we can think about? And again, are Canada and the US aligned on this in terms of how we approach tools like this? Any reflections you might have? This is a different way of thinking about collaboration, not necessarily in a multilateral context. Although, of course, sanctions work much better if they are, broadly adopted. But any thoughts you might have? Perhaps, James, I'll start with you.
So I am sort of cautiously optimistic or cautiously favorable about many of the sanctions that the U.S. has implemented to China with regard to the Uyghur issue. These include global Magnitsky sanctions, some entities list stuff, export controls initially, and then also the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act and that sort of raft of things. Not so much in that they are universally enforceable. There's still stuff from Xinjiang dates are showing up in Asian markets and outside DC and so on. Or necessarily even that they are causing a great amount of economic pain. Although I do think they have caused a hiccup in PRC, more than a hiccup, efforts to develop Xinjiang according to this long-term scheme of kind of using it as the last reservoir of cheap labor, basically, for in China. But through pushing this message that what's going on in Xinjiang is not on, pushing that through economic and particularly commercial and corporate channels, getting it to some provincial level officials, and particularly through the scrutiny of supply chains, which make it tricky to do business in China and to buy manufacturers from China, even if they don't, even things that are not physically produced in Xinjiang. You have to be very careful even things produced elsewhere, any kind of textiles, for example, are potentially coming from Xinjiang cotton. So at least judging from the degree of concern and the the level of the denunciations of this policy and so on, I think it's definitely messaging about that, and it has led at least to a rolling down of the camps, although not of incarceration generally. That's a longer story. Now, that of course is complicated by the continued Trump trade tariffs, which seem going to be continuing for a while. Other sorts of use of tariffs over technological issues and so on and so forth. So to a sense, they've all gotten kind of drowned out by a broader and often, I think, quite protectionist U.S. approach to China, which generally I don't approve of.
Yeah.
But I think that, and I have to admit my own ignorance as to what extent Canada is collaborating on this sanctions regime, and if there's a equivalent sort of forced labor law or something in the books like that.
Jenny.
Yeah,
I'll
no,
go to you too.
great question. I would just say one of the things we've been trying to is really that sunshine approach to what's happening in Xinjiang. I think one of our messages to Chinese authorities is, you have to let journalists back in, independent journalists, let the UN specialists and experts go, and let academics go and write and independent and assess and give them full and unfettered access to these locations. Doesn't have to be a Western government going in. Again, we're looking for some independent assessments of what is happening. Just on sanctions and forced labor, sanctions, we have issued sanctions in Xinjiang, not to the same extent that the U.S. have. I would say we have some work to do in this space, but I would say we have many tools in which we're looking at the whole China picture. Sanctions is but one of them. We are thinking critically about forced labor. It's more than just about forced labor, right? It is obviously this is something we're trying to look at and do a deep dive in all of our supply chains. What isn't in this room that isn't from China? And so and it's hard to, is this from Xinjiang or is this from Shanxi or is this from Shanghai? Like it's really tricky to know for our folks at the border, for our folks that are supposed to be banning products made from forced labor. How do you do this? And so we've been looking closely at the U.S. Examples. There's also, for those who might want to look into it, there's CUSMA obligations for us as well on forced labor. So this is really of importance for us, but it's a bit messy interdepartmentally in the federal government. So I won't go into the details of that, other than that we are catching up. We're moving in the same direction as our American friends, but we have some more internal work to do. I believe the budget announcement here in Ottawa just a few weeks ago did commit to new legislation related to forced labor. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks.
Just add 2
Yep.
minutes. Just I think one thing that we might want to also consider is complicity of companies based in the United States or Canada in human rights abuses. So separately, Human Rights Watch and myself both ended up writing in late 2022 reports on mass DNA collection in Tibet. And it turned out that actually one of the suppliers of the DNA collection kits was a US-based company, Thermo Fisher. And it was because of the really good work of the Tibetan diaspora, specifically students who are Free Tibet, that really pushed this issue and really compelled the US government to look at the complicity of a US-based company in this mass biometric data collection program within Tibet. And ultimately, it led to Thermo Fisher deciding quite quietly to withdraw from the Tibet market in the same way that they had from Xinjiang in 2019. Now, Thermo Fisher is continuing to sell equipment to the public security bureaus across the rest of China. But I think it does demonstrate that actually a combination of good research, political pressure, and also civil society activism, if it can't necessarily hold to account the Chinese state, that pressure could be applied to individuals, companies, or others based in Canada and the United States who are lending their support to state abuses within the PRC.
Yeah, good example.
Sorry, 5 seconds. I forgot to mention, you mentioned about possibly intake streams for individuals. We're keeping this low key, but it's not a secret, so I can share. But we do have dedicated streams for immigration, refugee streams for Uyghurs and folks from Hong Kong too. We're not broadcasting them widely for obvious reasons, but they do exist, and those communities are aware of them. So they're low key, and I believe we're the only country, Canada, that is offering a dedicated stream for Uyghurs looking for a place to go. So yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Interesting possible discussion with the U.S. I'm going to go to 2 questions, and I think we have to wrap up, right, Vincent? We've got, I think, enough time for that. Please.
Great. I'll introduce myself this time. Dean Baxendale. I just came back actually from Munich from the World Uyghur Congress, the celebration of the formation of the World Uyghur Congress 20 years, where I collaborate with a number of global experts on this issue, human rights issue of Tibet, Xinjiang. Professor Millward, thank you very much for your perspective and demonstrating that the claim to Tibet and to Turkestan is one that is, since the PRC reformed, they have not had a lineage for that for 2,000 years, as they claim. So I just wanted to talk on one thing about the UFLPA specifically. Americans introduced that legislation, a very strong piece of legislation. They've interdicted on 500 shipments, I believe. Well, we're talking 3,000 shipments, $500 million worth of goods. We have done 0. We've had 1. As a matter of fact, a number of those containers came up into the Vancouver port, and then we just shipped them back down to the United States with the tape on it saying banned from the United States. With global affairs, how do you see us? By the way, John McKay has a private members bill that's coming up very soon on our own legislation. How do we strengthen this, and how do we support Uyghurs and slave labor and making sure that Canadian corporations are not complicit with this regime?
Thank you. I'm going to take the second question as well, and then I'll invite any last comments. Please, at the back.
Yeah, thank you so much for this excellent panel. Actually, I have 2 very brief questions. First one is about whataboutism. We just a little touched upon this very briefly, right? So how can we dismantle this rhetoric coming from the CCP? What about you, right? What about your history, your reality? And yes, so you cannot judge us, right? With that kind of reality you have. So the second question is about Uyghurs. As a member of Uyghur community in Montreal, I often hear Uyghurs talk about two Michaels and Hussein Jalil, comparing these 2 cases. And yes, obviously there's double standards here, and I want to hear about Jennie Chen's response to this.
Yeah.
And yes, are you still pushing the CCP on this issue? And finally, I would like to express my appreciation for the Canadian government welcoming 10,000 Uyghurs to Canada. And that is a huge issue, huge kind of contribution or encouragement for the Uyghur population in Canada. And so, yes, these 2.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Maybe I'll start at the end. So there's a general question which links a little bit to my own about how do we address whataboutism? Do we give up simply because there's a counter narrative? How do we begin to think about that? And a couple of specific questions for Jennie around the Uyghur. But Dawn, I don't know if you have any last reflections you want to share.
2 on the whataboutism. I mean, 1, we need to live by our own values, and I think that helps some on all of these issues. But the other piece is that's part of why I emphasize we need to look at many different aspects of human rights. And if China is doing things that actually are in alignment with our values on human rights, or where we can cooperate and say positive things about their engagement, hopefully that will take away a bit of the power, because I think a lot of the perception right now is that human rights is just used as something to criticize China. And it's that China's not seen as a productive kind of great power in that space. And so I think hopefully that approach would help a bit on we can't completely eliminate it. But if we at least could say, well, we're working with you on X, Y, or Z, we acknowledge that in the economic development space or poverty alleviation or reconstructing Gaza in the longer term or all of these different issues, if we can at least acknowledge something positive, maybe there can be a bit more of a discussion.
Thank you. James, any thoughts?
So on whataboutism, I think it was Hu Xijin, one of the sort of wolf warrior, commentators on Twitter once I saw, and it was the tweet was something like, there's no genocide in Xinjiang, but what about the Native Americans in the U.S.? Which I thought was great because he made my comparative point for me, right? That by putting those situations, in juxtaposition, right? Exactly explain, this is how we see it. I think the answer when someone brings up an atrocity in response to a comment about an atrocity is to say, exactly, right? What about residential schools in Canada, America, and Australia? The response to that is, exactly. It was a bad idea. You shouldn't do it, right? And the problem is, I know if you're working for a government, you're not allowed to do that. And that's one reason I'm glad I'm not working for a government, because I can sort of say these kinds of things, right? But I think, seriously, it's transparency. And when I mentioned the humility, it's, understanding history and being willing to talk about it ultimately is the way to approach the whataboutism.
Sorry, would you like to jump in first?
No, Emile, go ahead. I'm going this way.
I see. Okay. So I think maybe in terms of the whataboutism question, one thing is we might want to just identify what are the principles that are actually motivating our criticism of China. I think there's a tendency for, won't name names, but there's a tendency among some people within Ottawa and DC to criticize China because it's China doing it. The problem is it's China committing the abuse. I think what we need to look at is the problem isn't that China's committing these abuses, it's that human beings are being hurt, right? We need to acknowledge that the fundamental principle is not that it's the PRC doing it, it's because we have a principled opposition to human rights abuses being committed in any country around the world. And I think if we embrace that kind of principled concern, then we should really do what the Chinese state doesn't do, which is actually openly acknowledge our crimes and our abuses and actually subject them to principled public debate, and then hopefully work on ways to both rectify those things at home and also, to James's point, kind of point out to countries like China, we acknowledge the criticisms that you're making. And what we're really doing in identifying the abuses within Xinjiang, Tibet, or elsewhere is saying, we really don't want you going down the same road as us, right? I think there's many whataboutism kind of arguments that are made in bad faith, but I do actually think it's an important problem to grapple with, because I think China has been very effective, again, among many countries, especially in the global south, of presenting that as an argument, both to as a cudgel to beat Canada and the States with, but also as a way to defend itself against external criticism.
Hi. Firstly, just on forced labor, I think we're very grateful to Mr. McKay and for his years-long fight to really raise the level of debate around forced labor. And it sounds like you're an expert. Very complicated issue. This is not just about a human rights issue. This is a huge economic issue. This is all about everything that we make in this world. And so let's just say we're catching up to where we need to be, but it is still going to be a long road ahead as we really think through the economic impacts and really communicating to Canadian business and Canadian importers to ensure when they're looking at doing international sort of business is that they're taking a good look at who their partners are around the world and where they're getting their stuff from. So I think that is our challenge to stakeholders here in Canada on that. On the infamous one container at the Port of Vancouver, I've heard about this many times. Yes, again, part of that work in progress for us on one, CBSA, the Canadian Border Services Agency, needs resources and intelligence and information in order. They cannot possibly open every single container that comes through the Port of Vancouver to look for cotton from Xinjiang. We have to help them, get them tools and information that will help our officers do this work in a way that is efficient. So because, as you know, CBSA, they're also looking for drugs, they're looking for weapons, they're looking for illegal things, they're looking for so many other things. How do you find that this pile of cotton is made from Xinjiang? We have to help them, give them more tools. So that is sort of the challenge that we have before us. How do we sort of implement what we want to do? And on Mr. Jalil, let's just say I'm looking at for Ambassador Saint-Jacques. This has been with us for many years. I spent many hours of my own time, and Mr. Nankervel, many weeks actually in Urumqi myself in front of that courthouse, trying to get in and get access. Mr. Jalil, unfortunately, is, of course, a dual citizen. China has never recognized his Canadian citizenship. We have never had access to Mr. Jalil over these 20 years, almost 20 years now. We still maintain contact with his family. In fact, in 10 days' time, there will be a small delegation going to Beijing. I'll be part of it, where we do fully intend on raising his case again. So this is Mr. Jalil's situation is never far from mind. So thank you.
Thank you. So just as I bring this to a close, two things. Firstly, I want to thank the organizers in a day of talking about regional security and cybersecurity to make space for talking about human rights. Canada and the United States are liberal democracies who both have constitutional commitments to human rights. And as you've heard on this panel in different ways, human rights are about groups, but they're also about individuals. And it's partly the need to shine light even on one individual that human rights is all about. And I would also say to the students in the room something that I've told you before. Even in a world where it gets thrown back that you're imperfect and where it's very easy to be cynical, we do not have the luxury of cynicism. We have to continue to try. We have to continue to care about human rights, even with our own flawed record. And I do think this is an area where some more creative collaboration between the United States and Canada, recognizing how different the world is right now on human rights and what we can do together about it. So thank you to the panelists.